So you've made it all the way to question 4D. So 4D is your 10-mark extended response. Now this extended response has quite clear, explicit structure, and it's got some very specific requirements. And those requirements can be broken into, I suppose, two things. There's the actual content, so the particular information you might have chosen to include. And then there's the skill requirements, as it were. And we break those kind of skill criteria requirements into a rubric, and there are levels or bands. And so there are 5 bands in a 10-mark question. And depending on the level of skill you display in each criteria, you will move bands. So at the bottom end of the band, okay, level 1, for example, is where you're getting 1 to 2 marks and you're really not meeting any of the criteria particularly well. At the top end, level 5, where you've got 9 or 10 marks, you're pretty much hitting each point that you need to. So I'm going to start by going through those criteria, and then we'll come back to the content that you might have included in this specific question. So, criteria. The first criteria we're looking for is your level of understanding about the demands of the question, okay? In other words, have you clearly understood what it's asking for and then selected the right theory, focus, examples to align with that, okay? Have you been able to reach a relevant response? So let's say that you understood the question generally, but you weren't 100% sure, so you threw in this extra point and that extra point. You're probably not in the top band because we've deducted a little bit for that lack of relevance. You haven't entirely understood the focus of that question. The second criteria that we're looking for is your use of business management theory and tools. In other words, have you, in selecting the relevant or understanding the relevant question, have you been able to select appropriate tools and ideas to use in your discussion? So did you throw in a random SWOT, or did you know that ANSOF might be an appropriate tool to use to answer this question, okay? Or we were asking you about CSR, did you correctly connect that to organizational objectives, or did you randomly start talking about CSR in whether or not they were a partnership or a sole trader, okay? Obviously you didn't do that, but just to give you an example of how that kind of, you're connecting the relevance to the theory that you're going to use. Having established that you've probably got good theory, okay, and it should be purposefully and well used. We're not just looking that you've picked it, you need to have effectively used it in that top band. We're then looking at how well you've used the stimulus material. So in this paper, you've got a case study, a whole 2-page case study, and some extra data which you can use, and you need to have made use of it in your response. So did you just give me 3 pros and 3 cons and come to a conclusion, and they're all good theory, but have no connection? Or were you able to justify each point that you made with reference to the case study? In that top band, you should have been using the case study constantly throughout your response. In the bottom band, you've probably just mentioned the word, so innocent drinks, okay? And then obviously the levels in between that. Assuming you're using the case study, have you got balance? So the 10 marker, unlike the 6 and 8, really emphasizes the balance of your argument. So if you give me 1 pro and 6 cons, it's not balanced, okay? You need to have given me some degree of perspective on both sides, all right? And it doesn't have to be even, we're not talking like 3 and 3, but it shouldn't be 1 and 4, okay? So achieving some balance in that response, because that then leads directly to the last criteria, which is reasoned judgments. So your 10 marker should have a conclusion, and each paragraph should conclude each point with a clear statement of how it affects that conclusion. This is where the reasoned judgments come in. So if you go on about A and B and then C and D, and then you get to your conclusion and go, the answer is 6, where's the reasoning? Does it match? Does it align with what you've put down? So those criteria, understanding, followed by use of theory, followed by the stimulus, followed by the balance, and of course ending with a reasoned judgment. So are you doing each of those things? So let's now talk more specifically about this question. So this question required, it was quite a challenging question, so I imagine some of you found it harder than others, but it required you to evaluate the effectiveness of their expansion strategy, which is obviously a little bit challenging because You can't talk about growth mechanisms and others because we haven't done that yet. So you were limited in how you could discuss it, but it was about what did you discuss. So things you might have talked about in terms of success or advantages or good things about their expansion, you could have mentioned things like the trend towards healthy eating. That kind of came up constantly in the case, and it's obviously a market that Innocent have tapped into. So this market means that their chances of expansion are quite good because that trend is quite widespread globally. You might also have talked about the fact that they want to go into places like Japan, who have a heavy focus on sustainability. You had that information in there. And that aligns with the organization's values and mission. So because of that alignment, they're likely to be successful. You might also have talked about the facts such as they're getting support and market research from Coca-Cola. So they're not doing this alone. Okay, they've got other supports, they've got experience coming in that are helping them to achieve this goal. And you could have talked about lots of other things. This is just a few things you might have mentioned, but the key here is that they're specifically related to the case. They're not just random kind of advantages and disadvantages of expansion. In terms of the negatives of the expansion though, you could have talked about things like the misalignment between what they do and how they target their market and other markets. There was a comment in the case study about how they've really struggled in parts of Europe because they're not catering. They're not catering to the niche markets. They're not catering to the different environments. So that could be a real challenge in terms of their expansion if they're not able to do that. You might also have talked about the fact that Japan is a very protected market. They have strong values around domestic production and around the types of goods and the way and kind of their cultural influence over them. And this is a foreign import. So you might have talked about that being a challenge for them. You might talk about the fact that expanding so broadly and so far away creates challenges of distance and time. You know, they're over here in the UK. Are they going to have language barriers? Is distance going to mean they can't have as much control over how things are operating, over the messages being sent, over what's happening in production? Time becomes an issue, okay? Having a meeting in different time zones is already challenging enough, but then you're trying to manage distribution and you're trying to manage marketing release, and all of these things have to happen, and distance just makes them harder. There were, of course, other things. If I was writing out this essay, I would have expected you to maybe make 3 points on each side. Okay, that would have been a nice number for a 10 marker. And then of course go through, connect those points to the case study and tell me how persuasive those points are. So for example, if we go back to the point about Japan being a very different culture and Innocent not being particularly good at adapting to different cultures, you might tell me that this is a really, really persuasive point or really strong point in favor that they're going to struggle with this expansion, because cultural adaptation is key to success in new markets. They have a poor history of it already, and Japan is very culturally closed. But you could also then say they've got the benefit now of Coca-Cola's experience, and this might help them to adapt more effectively in the future to allow them to overcome this challenge. That's a fully developed idea, okay? And that's what you need to be doing. This could be true, but because of this, it might not. Therefore, what's the conclusion? What outcome are you coming to? And there was no fixed right or wrong conclusion. You didn't have to say it was successful or it wasn't. You just had to say what you thought based on the arguments, and that's the reasoned bit. What conclusion would you have reached with the arguments you presented in this 10 mark